Good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me here tonight. And I'm chairing the session, The Adventure Community Working Toward a World Free of Plastic Pollution, which is something that I've been doing for a long time. I'm Hugo Tagham, and I run, as Fergal said, Surfers Against Sewage, which is somewhat of a misnomer these days. I surf myself, and I enjoy the ocean regularly. It's where I have my adventures, as I'm sure many of you do. I think tonight it's important to stress that anyone and everyone can have their own adventures every single day. You don't need to surf giant waves. You don't need to climb mountains. You don't need to tag wild animals to have your adventure or to make it any more authentic than people who do those things. And we can all take action on plastic and other pollution through those adventures. So it's important to recognise that. I'd like to welcome my fellow panellists, who I'm delighted and honoured to sit alongside. We have Louise Edge in the centre there, from the environmental campaigning heavyweights Greenpeace, an organisation that's long inspired me and one that I'm very, very pleased to see has a huge focus on marine plastic pollution today. And Louise leads the organisation's campaigns and policies on fishing, marine reserves, whaling and on plastic pollution. We're also joined by award-winning filmmaker Ellie Mackay, who works on conservation, healthcare and education documentaries worldwide. And her access to adventure is from volcano tops right down to the seabed scuba diving. So she will see plastic pollution entering the world at every single point. And last but not least, we have David Jones, who is a highly experienced underwater photographer and filmmaker who worked on the Plastic Ocean film, one that I'm sure you've seen, an amazing film, filmed at over 20 locations around the world, and one which was described by Sir David Attenborough as the most important film of our time. My interest in marine conservation and particularly plastic pollution or picking up debris started on the foreshores of the Thames here in London, or London on Sea as I like to call it, mudlarking with my brothers. This is me at the centre with my brothers Tom and Theo. And it's there that my dad used to take us down. We used to collect clay pipes and all sorts of things, relatively benign pieces of marine litter, really. I used to collect them and keep them in my room. And it's there that I started my journey. I don't really remember ever seeing any plastic at that stage. There weren't the tide lines of plastic bottles we now see on the Thames. Some 10% of litter in the Thames is plastic bottle pollution. Now, some of you might remember the vintage images of Surfers Against Sewage. These are campaigners back in the 1990s, the early days of the organisation, surfboard-carrying surfers in the centre of London calling for better water quality. But SAS has grown from a single-issue pressure group into one of the country's best recognised marine conservation and campaigning charities. Whilst the issues and tactics and the scale of SAS has changed over the last 30 years, one of the core aspects of the organisation hasn't changed. That's our supporters. The visceral and passionate connection that they have with the ocean is what drives the organisation. It's this direct experience, this adventure around our coastline, which means that we can be so powerful. So close is this connection that I've often heard our supporters described as marine indicator species themselves, the canary in the coal mine of these issues. People who live and breathe the ocean, people who are at the very coalface of the marine plastic pollution issue. They are pollution pioneers, and it's their adventures that bring these issues to public attention. Now, a couple of months ago, I had the great fortune of going down the London sewers at Blackfriars with some MPs and some Daily Mail journalists. It was a sort of a weird day. But Fergal talked about infrastructure, and I got to see the amazing infrastructure under the Thames, which is Joseph Bazalgette's amazing brickwork, the sewer system. Now, this was built in 1858 after what was called the Great Stink of London, a potent cocktail of sewage effluent, toxic chemicals coming out of industry, and all sorts of other detritus. And the stink in the summertime was so bad that it drove people out of London. And apparently it's the origin of why MPs are off for so long during the summer, because they couldn't bear to be next to the Thames. I don't know why it still lasts to this day. But in another cartoon for the time, this one called Monster Soup, this made me immediately think of the plastic pollution crisis. Whilst I was down in the bowels of London looking at Joseph Bazalgette's brickwork, I saw a tapestry of multicoloured, what I thought were spores at the time. But this wasn't spores, this wasn't biological matter, this was plastic pollution, microplastics. And so sure enough, in the time that SAS has been around, we've cleaned up bathing waters around the UK from 27% pass rate to now 98.5% for England's bathing waters. But at the same time, plastic pollution has blown up, and there are some truly shocking statistics for our beaches. Over 12 million tonnes of plastic enter the ocean each and every single year, 8 million pieces every single day, causing the death of millions of marine mammals and birds. This is my favourite beach. This is where I surf. This is where I take my son Darwin. A beautiful beach, Perranporth. Not so beautiful on this day. I surf there regularly, and I've seen birds, dolphins and seals entangled and dead on this beach because of plastic pollution. It seems like this was after Storm Hercules, that have made the organisation focus on plastic pollution. It's shocking to know that between 2002 and 2012, more plastic was produced than in all of time before that. In all of time before that. These sperm whales were washed up in Germany, their stomachs full of plastic pollution, dead and on the beach. It's time that it's time for new legislation to control plastic pollution for a plastic-free environment. With plastic production set to double in the next 20 years and quadruple by 2050, we're already in trouble, and we need to reverse that trend. And we as an organisation have responded to that. We've got 125 chapters around the coastline who mobilise some 30,000 volunteers each and every year. They contribute 150,000 hours of volunteering time to protecting our beaches from plastic pollution, worth about £1.5 million. They remove tons of plastic and recycle it. But what's important is what drove Bazalgette's development of the sewer system. It's legislation that drove that. We worked for several years on the plastic bag legislation, something that the public saw change overnight, but we were working in the background for a long time with a number of other NGOs to stop the flow of plastic into our environment. And that already has stopped 9 billion plastic bags from entering our world. Now, it's these sorts of pieces of legislation that can have real impact. You imagine 9 billion plastic bags. That's an 85% reduction in our usage of plastic bags. And that is the equivalent, I understand, in weight of about 500 blue whales or 5 million pelicans. I don't know where those facts come from, but there we go. So a massive, massive scale. And you imagine the number of beach cleans we'd need to do to stop that. That's the blue whale, just for reference. And we're on to our next issue now. We've got to tackle the production of throwaway plastics. This is what we're finding on our beach. This is what we're seeing year on year growing. We use a staggering 38.5 million plastic bottles in this country every single day, and only half of those are recycled. That's 16 million left to enter the ocean, litter our streets, litter our countryside, or be burnt. This isn't good enough. We can do much better. So we're calling for a deposit return system in this country, something that can trap almost 100% of plastic bottles in the recycling economy. Shockingly, we only recycle 9% of plastics globally at this stage. We've taken the voice of over 300,000 supporters to Downing Street in our call for this. We've given evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, and we're seeing ministers and pressuring them for this to happen as soon as possible. This is an immediately available solution for a huge problem that we see every day in every part of the country. But we can do much more as individuals as well. We can all do our piece for plastic-free coastlines. We can refuse single-use plastics each and every single day. Every action that we take can be plastic-free. I wanted to leave you with a couple of slides. One of a boat that we built to launch our Plastic-Free Coastlines campaign. This was built out of some of the 50,000 plastic bottles that our volunteers collected from beaches in the last few months alone. And what we really want to see is a coastline like this, free of plastic, somewhere people can have a healthy, happy life, somewhere for the future. And I'd like to hand over to Louise from Greenpeace, who's going to tell you some more about their amazing work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hugo. My name's Louise Edge, and as Hugo explained, I lead the ocean plastics work for Greenpeace in the UK. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that ocean plastic pollution is one of the biggest threats facing our oceans globally now, alongside, of course, climate change and overfishing. You've heard some of the statistics already, but since plastic was invented and popularised in the 40s and 50s, it's estimated that that's resulted in some 5 trillion individual pieces of plastic now existing in our oceans. And adding to that every year, we have up to 12 million tonnes of plastic, which, to give you a sense of the scale of that, that's like a rubbish truck full of plastic, dumping its contents into the ocean every minute. So this is a real pressing issue. For me, my most extreme experience of witnessing the plastic pollution problem was around a year and a half ago when I was privileged to go to Manila Bay in the Philippines and take part there in a beach cleanup with a community group. And what I saw there truly shocked me. It was plastic pollution beyond anything I've seen. I mean, we've seen what's happened at UK beaches, and I've been involved in a lot of cleanups in the UK. But this was a beach that was entirely covered. It was a bird sanctuary, the area that we were working in, entirely covered with plastic. There was also plastic clogging the ocean in front of the beach. And as we cleaned up, we collected bags full, bags full, bags full. It became clear that actually it was meters deep at places. So for the geologists in the room, that will give you a sense of, we're now creating so much plastic waste, you'll be able to mine it in the future. And as much as we collected, talking to the local volunteers that work on that beach regularly, we knew that when we came back the next day, there would be yet more plastic. So while cleanups are really important, they're very important as an awareness raising, they're a way of getting rid of some of the problem. Clearly, what we need to do is to be switching off the plastic tap, stop putting all of this single-use plastic into our oceans. So plastic pollution clearly isn't just a problem in Manila. Today, plastic is being found wherever scientists look, basically. So Manila Bay was one place, but it's being found everywhere. So from uninhabited islands in the Pacific, like Henderson Island, which was in the news recently, where scientists had collected 38 million pieces of plastic waste. This is an uninhabited island. It's also being found in Arctic ice. It's being found in the world's deepest ocean trench, so the 10-kilometre deep Mariana Trench. They found extensive plastic contamination at the base of the trench. Closer to home, we did a scientific expedition recently around the coast of Scotland with Greenpeace Germany's boat Beluga, documenting plastic, doing water samplings. And what we found, again, was plastic everywhere. So we were finding the waste on beaches. We were also privileged to be able to go into sanctuaries, bird sanctuaries. And there what we found was plastic in the birds' nests, plastic being fed to the young. And we also found that when we sampled the water bodies, and we're looking at places where we've got kind of crucial populations of things like basking sharks living, we found plastic every time. So why is this plastic a particular problem? Well, it takes hundreds of years to break down once in the ocean environment, and that's a massive challenge. It's basically the worst place for a material to degrade, so biodegradable doesn't help. It breaks down very, very slowly, and what it breaks down into is lots of tiny pieces of plastic that are even easier for ocean life to ingest. It can entangle and drown creatures like seabirds and turtles, and I'm sure we've all seen those images. But also, it's a real problem because creatures from the tiniest creatures like zooplankton up to the great whales are eating plastic. They mistake it for food. And once eaten, it can puncture their digestive systems, or it can just make them feel full. So we have instances of turtles dying because they think that they're full. Their stomachs feel full. And again, this problem is really widespread. So scientific estimates are 1 in 3 turtles and between 70 and 90% of seabirds will have ingested plastic. Clearly, we need to stop this constant flow of plastic getting into our oceans and switch off the tap. So what can we do about it? Research shows that basically the majority of plastic that is ending up in our oceans comes from land. So clearly we need to act on land. Another thing that it tells us is that along with microfibers, one of the major things that we find when we look in the oceans and on our beaches is single-use plastic packaging. So that's your plastic bags that we've been talking about, it's single-use plastic bottles, it's straws. So that's why Greenpeace is really focusing its energy on challenging the multinational corporations that basically produce and use this single-use plastic packaging and telling them it's time to end. We need to phase out single-use packaging. So at the moment, our focus is on Coca-Cola and the soft drinks industry. Coca-Cola, it was quite shocking when we actually looked at the stats. They refused to disclose to us how many plastic bottles they produce each year. We did a survey of all of the big soft drinks companies. All of them disclosed data, apart from Coca-Cola. But we had an investigator look at all the available data that they had released, and we concluded that they produce around 110 billion bottles a year. That's 3,400 bottles a second. It's a vast, vast, vast amount. On top of that, we can see that the trend within Coca-Cola and other soft drinks companies is increasingly to use single-use plastic. So as a sector, they're moving away from reusable bottles, be that glass or plastic, and they're switching to single-use plastics because it's more convenient for them and it's cheaper. So we are taking the challenge to Coca-Cola, or rather, our supporters are taking the challenge to Coca-Cola in the UK, but also around the world globally, and saying to them, you need to be, as the biggest soft drinks company in the world, as a massive corporation with amazing power in terms of how it is we get our soft drinks. And you need to announce a phase out of single-use plastic bottles. You need to invest in reusable bottles, reusable packaging, and then you need to innovate. So you need to look at new ways that you can get your drinks to people, essentially. Beyond the soft drinks sector, we're looking to challenge corporations right across the fast-moving consumer goods group, as it's called, so companies that produce a lot of packaging. And we're asking them to shift to a more circular production mode. So that involves simply stopping using plastics that cannot be recycled. And I'm thinking here of materials like PVC, which is still quite extensively in use. Also things like polystyrene that simply cannot be recycled, therefore end up in landfill, they end up in our rivers, they end up in our oceans. That's a no-brainer as far as we're concerned. We're also calling them to invest in reusable packaging and to ensure that if they do use plastics, that those plastics are both 100% recyclable, but also made from recycled material. So that creates the market incentive for that plastic to be captured. It gives a value to plastic, very much like deposit return schemes. We're also calling on governments to act. So we're calling on to introduce new regulations and incentives to get rid of throwaway plastic, to get us beyond this throwaway plastic era that we're living in. So we're part of a coalition that achieved the UK ban on companies using microplastics in consumer goods. So microplastics are basically tiny pieces of plastic that are added to things like face scrubs and toothpaste. And what the evidence was showing was, obviously, they get flushed, they go down the sink, they end up in our oceans. That has been a very successful campaign. It's had an awful lot of public support here in the UK, and we're just waiting on the promised legislation, which is going to put in a complete ban on microplastic being used in certain wash-off products. It can go further, but it's a really good first step. We're also supporting the works to have a bottle deposit return scheme adopted throughout the UK, which Hugo's touched on already. So this is a scheme where you just add a small charge to a drinks container when you buy it. Then when you return it, you get the money back. All the evidence shows everywhere that it's been implemented, which, it's implemented in parts of the US, Australia, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany. It's incredibly successful because the bottle has a value. People bring it back, they get their money back. We're seeing rates as high as 95% return. So we think for the UK, it's a no-brainer. Scotland's already announced that they're going to implement a deposit return scheme, which is amazing news. Even better, Wales is now considering following suit, and the UK government is actively considering it. So that's a real chance for change and something that can make a real significant difference that is coming through quite soon, I think. But yeah, I think a key thing that I want to stress, because there's so much bad news, is actually with plastic pollution, we do have a real chance of solving this problem. More data is coming through. The scale of the problem is becoming clear. But what we're seeing, which for me, as somebody that's worked on many campaigns over the years, this is a campaign that has really gripped the public imagination. We're seeing incredible responses from the public to things like the deposit return scheme petitions, the microbeads petitions. There's a real chance for change. The adventure community and environmentalists have already massively increased public awareness. And now is the time that we really need to force companies and governments particularly to act. There are so many exciting initiatives that are coming through at the moment. Every month it feels like some small group somewhere is coming up with a new initiative. So whether that's about getting free water installed, so water fountains installed in places like Bristol, whether that's pressuring supermarkets to get rid of plastic cotton buds, or also news coming from abroad. We're seeing a lot of news about Africa, Kenya, for instance, banning the use of plastic bags. So there's so much that can be done. There's so many inspiring stories out there that you can help support, but also there's a real opportunity for you as an individual to take action, not just in your own life, but making sure that your places of work start getting rid of single-use plastic, things happen in your community, things happen in your schools. So yes, I'll end there. So I think really together, if we really pull together, we've got a massive opportunity right now to turn this problem around. And I hope everybody wants to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise.
Hi, everyone. I've always been very aware of the plastics issue and environmental issues in general. And I think I did what I'm sure everybody here does, which is always switching off your lights and recycling and using your own shopping bags and all that kind of thing. And I think we all do these things and convince ourselves that that's enough. We sort of tick that box and think, yeah, I'm a good citizen. But when I was taking part in something called the Plastic Tide, which was a 4,500 mile journey that I undertook this spring around the UK coastline, there's a stall outside all about the Plastic Tide mission. We used a drone to survey plastic on beaches to build an aerial map of plastic around the UK. It's never been done before. It's a fantastically amazing project. Pete Kohler, the founder, is here. When I was on that mission, that's when something changed for me. So it's shocking to see how bad the conditions were. I mean, we've all seen the images of Indonesia and Thailand and India, and Louise, you mentioned about how bad it is there. But I would say that the UK was shocking to me. We have an image of the kind of Cornish coastlines and the Scottish coastlines as being these kind of wild, rugged, poldark style, pristine, wild places. But in fact, they're just rubbish dumps. We found over a ton of plastic waste on one beach in northern Scotland, really remote beach, found over a ton of rubbish in less than an hour. So the thing is, when you see this stuff, when you see toothbrushes and cotton buds and tampon applicators and wet wipes and food wrappers, and you see them half degraded and covered in muck and oil in the seaweed, you see them in a different way. You later then go into a supermarket and you see rows of toothbrushes. I don't see those as hygienic products anymore. I see them as trash. they are disgusting to me to look at. It's such a visceral response. The only thing I can compare it to is if you've had a dodgy curry and you've had a really bad night of food poisoning, you don't ever want to see curry again, you know, and that feeling stays with you, that you're just disgusted and appalled by it for many months, if not years. And that intense feeling was so sort of brutal and raw that it felt like I'd been on a 3-month plastic poisoning trip. So when I see the sandwiches and the Coke bottles in Starbucks today, I don't see that food. I see trash and dead animals and sewage and, you know, a filthy ocean. So it was very, very powerful. The thing is, it's quite easy to recreate that feeling. Unfortunately, we can't take everybody on like a 3-month plastic torture trip. I don't know that would be particularly good if we did that. We aren't able to do that, but it's up to us to bring that feeling to them. So as a filmmaker, you know, it's my role to try and create an immersive environment, whether that be jungle or coastline or whatever the film is about. And I know that I can recreate those feelings with some effort and some skill. It can be done. It's easy to tap into those negative feelings, the disgust, the fear, the outrage, the anger, the horror. It's why the horror film industry is so successful. It's why reality TV and documentaries trade in those negative feelings. I always say, my joke is that a lot of documentaries you see on TV, they're like, super mega death tornado, the world is going to end and it's your fault and there's nothing you can do about it and we're all going to die. And that has some merit. It gets people watching. But it's not enough to just stop there. What happens is that creates blame, it creates guilt, and there's nowhere for that to go. And all that does is divide us. And we start saying, well, what are you doing about it? Well, I'm not going to do it. Well, what are you doing? Well, it's all Coca-Cola's fault, which it is to some degree. But where does that get us? So what we need to do is to harness all that negative energy, which is important. It needs to be the trigger. But we need to take that imagery and turn it into positive collaboration. We need to offer hope and solutions. What we need to do is praise each other when we are getting it right, so that the voices of positive, optimistic solutions in the future are louder than the negative ones. And that feeling of hope is bigger than that feeling of disgust. So my passion is giving a voice to those who aren't being heard. The good thing is that there's this swell of voices nowadays. Surfers Against Sewage, Paddlers Against Plastic, Kids Against Plastic, the Raw Foundation, Barnacle Babes, Greenpeace. The list is endless. We're all on the same team, and we're all shouting all these similar messages. So my thing is, how do we frame these campaigns to make sure they're inclusive and positive? We need to make sure that they are campaigns and not crusades. For me, the answer is in the adventure community, who are traditionally seen as optimistic. Adventure is all about, you can do anything if you persevere, climb that mountain, get to the top. It's all about anyone can do what they want. It's always been a positive and kind of limitless rhetoric within exploration. Anything is possible. That's the rhetoric that we need to tap into. So the adventure community, to me, has 3 main sort of bonuses. Number 1, it has access. We go to the front lines. We are where man meets nature. We see it firsthand. We're visiting local communities where we can make change from the ground up. Number 2, they have an audience. Many of the speakers tonight are highly influential. They have a huge following. And not just within the adventure community, many of whom are already converted, kind of preaching to the choir, but the adventure community has a cross-societal expanding public. We need to introduce these concepts to people who may not have a clue about plastics, but they will watch Bear Grylls on TV, or they will read Ranulph Fiennes' new book. Those are the people that we can access through this community. And thirdly, we care. As a community, we are the last people who want to see the world turned into a giant garbage dump. And we have a vested interest, which means that this is not a publicity stunt. We have the authenticity behind what we're saying. So my call to action would be for the adventure community, firstly, to make sure that we're all incorporating sustainable methods in our own travel. And I have a stall outside as well that's got all sorts of plastic-free kit and gear. But also to act as authentic role models for positive change by promoting this issue at every opportunity so that we can be a louder, more cohesive voice for responsible travel. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Good evening. Unlike everybody else, I haven't prepared a script because I was just going to come here for a Q&A. Sorry? Yeah, just crack on. So I haven't got a script, I told you. Just to give you a bit of, so I'm going to keep this brief because I want to get to Q&A. I think that's probably what you're all here for. I've been diving for 40 years. Quite clearly, you can tell I started when I was about 2 years of age. However, what I have noticed over those years, and I've had some amazing adventures, and this is an adventure uncovered event, so I want to kind of bring it to that. I have seen, one of the things I've seen is an incredible increase in the amount of pollution, plastic pollution and stuff like that. I was at the World Ocean Summit in February in Bali. Somebody's got to go. All right. Now, the previous time that I was there was 1986, and I was a young officer in the army serving with the Gurkhas, and I was in Hong Kong. It was close enough. Why not? And I went over there, and the thing that I'd noticed in the change in that place, first of all, was the amount of plastic pollution on the beaches. How does this work? First of all, was the amount of plastic pollution on the beaches, and the other thing was the number of motorbikes, which is just off the scale and completely crazy. But the world has changed, and why is that? What's happened? And I think if we can understand what's happened, we can possibly think about what the solution might be. This is the way that I kind of work on these things. All right. What's happened is, in the same way that when Nicolaus Otto invented the four-cycle engine in 1878 or 76 or whatever it was, he had no idea that millions of these things were going to be produced and they were going to change the environment totally. All right. When Fleming introduced penicillin, he had no idea that 30, 70 years down the line, we're going to be using so much of it that it's becoming ineffective against some bacteria. Right? And in the same way, when we introduced plastic, 1955, Life or Time magazine, Life magazine, this is a disposable product. You can throw it away, and you're never, ever going to have to do it or wash up again. All right? So why is that? Well, first of all, it's because of poor waste management, and secondly, it's human neglect. We've produced more than we can manage. Plastic is not a bad product. It's what we do with it. It's how we use it. Right? And we haven't thought it through, and that's what we do. Now let's think about that again. How can we change that? Somebody spoke about how the system in Germany is working with the plastic bottles. Yes, it is. But there's a reason for that. It's called extended producer responsibility. The people who make it pay for it, okay? Not the people who buy it, although obviously that cost is put onto it. And I don't think we're going to legislate our way out of this problem. One of the biggest things, and I was talking to somebody at the beginning of this conference before we all sat down, is that if you think about it, most of the plastic you get, you haven't actually paid for. Well, you don't think you have. You have. But there's no charge on your plastic at all. And therefore, it has no value. And basic economic principles say if there is no value, then you overuse something. So I think we need to put value back into it. One of the reasons that people throw plastic into the drains in Bali is because it has no value to them. And I think we can do that. And as adventurers, you get to all these places and you're going to see that more than anything else. And if we can send that message, I think that's good. I'm going to leave it there because I want to go Q&A.
Thank you, David. Well, as David rightfully pointed out, this is an opportunity for you to ask some questions of the panel. And so if we could have some house lights so we can actually, so I can see the audience, then we could take some first questions. Has somebody got a question they'd like to ask the panel? Yep.
I have heard everything you said, and I've only heard, I think, the word river used once or twice. We talk about the tap. And right now it's the everybody, somebody and nobody. Everyone's pointing in different directions. But in our rivers from our towns is the tap. And it seems strange to me that the Environment Agency will step over gross plastics and sample suspended solids or whatever with no measure and no responsibility on anybody for that plastic. So I get cap tax, I get all of those things and deposit schemes, but surely there's also a place of getting our local authorities and our environment agency that already exist to start measuring and monitoring and cleaning this stuff.
David, would you like to take that question?
I'm more than happy to. Do you want to use one of these? I'm more than happy to answer that one. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems we have in this country is that we don't have, or in any country, is that there is, well, Germany have, there is no national decision that's been made. There's no national policy on how we should do stuff. I mean, I live in Southsea on the south coast, all right? They will take my plastic. Now, which plastic do they take? Well, out of the 7 groups, how do you know which one it is? Because I'm a nerd and I've been doing this for 8 years, I kind of can work it out. But I think the problem is not that they should be taking out of rivers and stopping the tap. The tap is beyond that. The tap is further upstream, if you like. The tap stops at your house. The tap stops in the park. You know, I mean, I look at the pictures from Glastonbury and places like that, all right? And I know it's an event, and I know that an army of workers go and clean it up. But I'm sorry, that's just wrong. That is not how you treat the environment. It's not how I was brought up, and I'm sure it's not how most of you were brought up. But that whole notion of we can throw stuff away because we haven't paid for it is something we need to get rid of. Everything has a value. I mean, you know, if I was to write another, I'm doing university stuff now, but if I was to write a paper, I would write a paper saying there's no such thing as waste, only resources. You know, and one of the comments earlier was that crisp packets can't be recycled. Yes, they can. It's just not a very cost-effective product. So how do you recycle it? Well, be pragmatic. If the only thing you can do with it is burn it and make energy out of it, at least it's better than sticking it a hole in the ground. So I think the tap needs to be further up, rather than putting the blame on the Environment Agency for not cleaning up rivers, if that makes sense.
I'm not putting the blame on them, I'm just saying you could turn, I mean, I can tell you in 1 mile I can get 10 bags of rubbish out in our local river because we've done it regularly.
So is your question that you think it should be measured in rivers, plastic pollution, and there should be because of course we've got that there are measures, there are surveys that take into account plastic pollution, but there is also more and more evidence or more and more surveys looking at the microplastics and microfibers as well, which is of course the emerging trend. Ellie.
Can I come in and say that with the Plastic Tide, which is this aerial survey to build a map of plastic pollution, one of our next goals will be to not just map coastlines, but to move to rivers, reservoirs, like any body of water, and of course roads, railways, anywhere that you can fly over, you can scan. And the good thing about that is that those surveys will be uniform across the entire country and eventually the entire world. So one of the main problems that councils have is they don't know where the waste is necessarily or accurately. So there's the new technologies that are coming out, like the drone surveys, will hopefully be able to help us to build that picture, and then that is irrefutable evidence that you can go to your local council and say, look at this map, look at how bad this river is, or this section of lake, or whatever it might be. This is where you need to focus your efforts.
And I'm not saying that's wrong. What I think is important here is that the council wouldn't have to say that that's where that waste is if there was value on it in the first place and people didn't throw it away because they thought, hang on a second, this is worth some money, or I can do something with it.
Can we have another question? In the middle here.
The whole conversation so far has been about the consumer end of plastic. But there is a whole business-to-business world. We're trying to solve a problem with potentially 9 billion end users. That's quite a big audience to talk to, quite a big challenge. I don't know what the global figure for businesses and business-to-business supply chain is, but I suspect it's significantly smaller, where there is a much clearer, I work in the business-to-business world, where we have a very clear focus on value, and where we can get that value back, and we have logistics systems for returning things and everything else, which the householder, the end user, doesn't. I spent the last 2 years of my life working on the circular economy in various different forms, and it always ends up talking about end of life and consumers. And probably we can take, a bit like you're getting further up the food chain, in terms of the plastic coming into the water, if we actually stop thinking so much, spending so much of our effort thinking about Mrs. Smith and her house and her shopping habits and everything else, to start thinking about the businesses that put all that plastic in front of us all this every day, we might actually have a smaller number of people to try and change the mind of, rather than, I just think we're wasting a lot of time on consumers when we ought to be talking to the business supply chain first.
Thank you for that question, and I'll put this one to Louise, who of course is working with engaging businesses with Coca-Cola and other brands. So Louise.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Everybody has a role to play, of course. But one of the things that has been very, very evident when I got into this issue and talking to companies is all they want to talk about is the individual's responsibility. Whereas if you look at it as a problem with our system, which it is, then who can, an individual cannot change that system unless they happen to be a very powerful individual that is running a corporation, or a very powerful individual that's in government, which is why our focus, even though totally there are so many things that individuals can do, both in their everyday life, as I said before, but in terms of generating change, coming up with the solutions, and there are communities out there doing that, and that's part of the positive narrative of what can be done. But in terms of responsibility, it's down to businesses to take this very seriously. I mean, the good news, I think, is it's such a huge issue now. It really is getting onto the business agenda, and I'm fairly confident that we will see some changes coming through in the next years.
Thank you. We've got another question up at the back.
There's been a lot of talk of sort of UK government level, individual level, but not much about sort of international commitments. And there is a model for this, which is, I suppose, if you look at what's happened with carbon emissions over the last 20, 30 years, what's the panel's view on how far this issue is away from getting to where the international community got to on carbon emissions, which is an international commitment to do this, which is finding its way to government policy?
I'll just immediately respond, but then I'll hand over. I think there is increasing, of course, awareness around plastic pollution. I was at the Our Oceans conference in Malta just a couple of weeks ago, and it is amazing to see the amount of certainly political awareness and connectivity now on this plastic pollution issue. I was amazed that the issue of plastic in our oceans wasn't just talked about in its own right, but whether they were talking about sustainable fisheries or climate change and protecting our oceans, plastic pollution came up time and time again. And everyone quoted the statistic of more plastic than fish in the sea by 2050. And so I think we're moving in the right direction. Of course, we're behind the curve of discussions on climate change, but I'm seeing a very positive movement. Certainly when I started at SAS, which was 2008, I'd never dreamt that plastic pollution would be at this level, and we'd be discussing it with politicians, not least in UK government, but around the world. I'd hand over to David again.
I think you're absolutely right. I'll do that. I'll just I think you're absolutely right. But the problem we've got when you start taking things to international level is the complexity increases. I mean, 1992, Agenda 21, Chapter 17 told us how we were going to look after our oceans with an integrated coastal management system. Okay, you only have to look at the number of organisations involved, for example, in areas that are not within national legislation, to see how many organisations get involved with that. And I think this is one of the big problems we got. I think we need a directive, and I think things like the Germany model, which actually puts on extended producer responsibility, so that they pay for it. They don't pay for it; the consumers actually pay for it. But that is the way ahead. It's a management tool. Is it ideal? No. Do the businesses, going back to Matt's thing earlier on, which you said, do they actually see it as a hurdle that's going to cost them money rather than an opportunity to increase their profits, reduce their costs, and increase their market share? It's just crazy. So I think there is a requirement for it, but I think we need to get our own houses in order first as well, because at a national level or at a regional level, it's a lot easier than doing it at an international level.
Thank you. Can we have one more question up at the back? We've got a couple of minutes left. So.
To what extent does the panel think plant-based plastic substitutes are part of the solution?
Louise, would you like to take this again?
I'm aware that, yes, it's very much being touted around, particularly by businesses, as being the solution to the problem. I think one obvious thing is from an ocean perspective, it doesn't solve that problem. So you still have issues around entanglement, you still have issues around ingestion of plastic by marine creatures. But Another key issue is the obvious one. You know, if we're going to make all of the plastic we're currently producing and meet this apparent demand for more and more plastic that Hugo flagged on his slide earlier, where are the crops going to come from on a planet where the population is getting bigger? There is more and more pressure on land for agriculture. We're trying to preserve our remaining forests, etc., etc. Where does the space come from? It's a huge challenge.
One of the things I like to always look at and do some research into use of waste plant materials. So these are the sort of cut-offs from already existing crop systems. An example being the leather you can buy that's pineapple leather or banana leather, which is made from the waste leaves from the banana crop. So there are alternatives which don't have that impact in terms of new crop requirement, new land requirement, but you know it's still in its infancy. We're at a stage now with technology that who knows what's going to be coming up, and if there's a lot of investment into that research, then I'm sure we can come up with some solutions.
I think there's also an issue with it. Thanks for that, Ellie. But with the bioplastics, the conditions they need to degrade, but also that they can contaminate the recyclates. So if we are recycling more, we don't want them to contaminate the PET or other materials that we can put back into a more circular economy. So there's lots of questions over the efficacy or the notion of these types of biodegradable plastics. We could have time for one more quick question if there are any. Up at the back over there.
Is that me?
Yep.
Yeah. Are you aware of any negative environmental impacts from polyvinyl alcohol-based plastics?
PVC?
No,
PVA.
It's not something we're working on directly. It's something that some of the panelists may have.
I've read both sides. There's nothing overly. I wouldn't want to say categorically either way because I've read sort of convincing stuff on either side, but nothing from reputable sources. If you have something, I'd love to know. But yeah, it's something that I think is true with a lot of materials, especially the new materials that are coming out, that the jury's still out on exactly the environmental impacts and positive and negatives. It takes years to gather the data to look at these impacts. We might not know for 10 or 20 years what the impacts are of plastics in the ocean, for example, the amount of surveying and the time required. So it may be that we're still discovering and still finding out what the actual positive and negatives are.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists for an interesting discussion and great presentations. And we'll move on to Adam Hall.